Hey, hello everyone. It's Janae Paylett here with the Power of Pleasure. And today we're going to talk about your sexual blueprint. I'm, just so you know, effective this week. I will be starting again my Talking Love, Sex, and Intimacy Facebook Lives with Janae, which I've been doing. I kind of took a break for the summer. Hello. Hi, Greg. And hi, Mark. And I'm starting again. So I'm excited to be doing this. And today we're going to be talking about a sexual blueprint and what a sexual blueprint is and how you can understand what your own sexual blueprint is. And I'm going to actually be reading from my new book, Living an Orgasmic Life, or at least a piece of it, because the third chapter in this book is about sexual blueprints. And sexual blueprints are important because our sexual blueprint has a pretty big impact on how we show up as an adult sexually. So what our relationship with sex is as an adult, how we interact with partners, the fears that we may have, the shame that we may have, the turn-ons that we may have as well, is very much related to your sexual blueprint. So let me just read a little bit from this book so you can understand it a little bit. A sexual blueprint. A sexual blueprint is similar to an architectural blueprint that shows all the details of the plumbing, electricity, drywall, windows, and doors that make up a building. You have a sexual blueprint comprised of all of the early life experiences that make up your sense of yourself as a sexual being. I call it a blueprint to emphasize the impact of these early experiences that govern your relationship with your own sexuality, as well as how you relate to members of the opposite or the same sex. And there's several elements in your sexual blueprint. And in a moment, I'm going to just take you through an exercise, and you can even, if you want, write some comments below. I think I can see them. Hi, John. Hi, Brumsh. But I want to talk about the elements of your sexual blueprint. So the first are messages that you received about sex as a child from your parents, from other adults, and from society in general. The second piece of it is any early childhood sexual explorations you had with yourself or others. Like, remember when you used to play doctor maybe when you were young, or early experiences of touching yourself. The relationship that you had with your primary caregiver, that could be your mother or some other primary caregiver. Seminal events that impacted your body image. There's so often when I work with men will tell me about the time that they were in the locker room in gym and maybe they weren't as sexually developed as some of their friends, and so their penis was smaller and they got made fun of and really shamed. That is a huge issue that I see comes up time and time again. Religious ideology or indoctrination. So for those of us who were raised with a very strict religious background, or in a country or a culture where shame is not really, where sex is not really talked about, and where there's a lot of shame around it, that is a very huge piece of our sexual blueprint. So I want to, here's some of the questions for you to be asking yourself around your sexual blueprint. So these are just some questions for you guys to consider. This is also in the book. There's little examples around it. So here's some of the things to think about. Did you see your parents hold hands and touch each other? Right? The way in which we see our parents interact with each other, the way in which they model intimacy and sex, has an impact on whether or not we feel as adults it's normal to be touching our partner or holding our partner's hand, or cuddling with them in bed. Same thing, did your parents kiss in front of you? Were those kisses tender, or were they just like the perfunctory little peck on the mouth or peck on the cheek? Were you allowed to crawl into your parents' bed and cuddle with them? Did you ever see your parents or other adults naked? And what were the circumstances under which that happened? Were you one of those people where your parents like covered your eyes every time there was a romantic scene on TV? And again, that's a message of like, oh, don't watch this, and it creates shame. And shame is one of the things that holds us back from being really sexual. Was there ever any discussion of sex in your family? So I want to give you some ideas of how this impacts people. And these are just stories from this book, actually, around of clients that I actually had or have worked with. So in one situation, I was working with a woman, and she was telling me this story, and this is actually a pretty common story about, she was kind of a tomboy growing up, and she used to run around with her shirt off, just like her brothers ran around with her shirt off when she was 5 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. Thanks, Bromch, for sharing this. Great. And there was nobody ever said anything about it. It was totally, totally fine. Then she started getting a little bit older. So she was like 10 and started developing breasts. And when she started developing breasts and she was running around outside, one day she saw her mother drive up and was coming home from work, I think is what she said. And she saw her daughter bare-chested with her breasts showing. She was like 9 or 10 years old, right? Totally innocent. And she came like screeching up to her in the car and yelling at her and telling her to get in the car. And this poor girl, she had no idea what was going on. But what was really happening was that her mother was feeling inappropriate about the fact that finally her daughter was, having breasts, and felt a lot of shame about allowing her to be running around with her shirt off. And as a result of this client of mine, hi Irene, as a result of this client of mine had severe body shame issues, like really severe body shame issues. And it all stemmed from this incident when she was 8 or 9 years old, right? So these early experiences really, really have a big impact on us. And when I work with clients and try to understand, like, why are you feeling shut down, or why is this a problem for you, we often end up finding that there are these type of circumstances and these type of experiences that they had that actually create a lot of shame for them. And shame is one of those nasty words. I call it the nastiest word in the nastiest 5-letter word in the universe that really does have a big impact on our sexuality. And this book, Living an Orgasmic Life, is all about how we can heal our shame and heal our relationship with sex. So for those of you who just joined in, Janae Paylette here, and we're talking about your sexual blueprint. And your sexual blueprint are the messages that you received around sex growing up. And we're looking at what's the impact that those messages actually have on you as an adult with respect to how you show up for partners and for yourself around your sex life. I want to give you another example. So it's not infrequent that people come to see me because they're feeling totally frozen. Frozen is a word I hear a lot, or totally shut down. Hey, Chip, around sex as well. And this was an interesting example, an interesting experience. I was working with another female client in this case, and she was somebody who couldn't have an orgasm, couldn't feel any pleasure. She actually felt numb when a partner tried to touch her genitals or her pussy. And I was doing a practice with her where I had her just lying on a table and just started to touch her very, very gently on her arm, but in a very, very sensual way. And all of a sudden, she just burst out in tears. And she told me this story, and it was a pretty powerful story. So she grew up in Iran. I think it was Iran. So a very sexually shut down society, right? And she was told me she was like 10 or 11 years old, and she was driving in the car with her mother. And next to her, or they saw passing her, was this woman and man on a motorcycle. And the woman was like holding on to the guy, right? Like as you do when you're on a motorcycle. And she described like this woman had like this long hair and it was flying freely through the air. And it was kind of a turn on for her. And she actually said to her mother, she didn't say I'm turned on, she was 10 years old, but she was like, wow, I wish I could be that woman, right? Because it was exciting, right? This is like the stereotypical picture of the woman and man on the motorcycle. And there's a lot of sense of freedom and sexuality that comes through that and desire. And her mother immediately slapped her face and said to her, that girl's a slut. And if you do that, you're going to be a slut too. So here's the way in which that message, she got the negative message around pleasure. Hi, Peter. She got the negative message around pleasure, that if you feel pleasure, if you feel turned on, you're going to be a slut. This is like a really high level of slut shaming, but it happens all the time. And so what she told me was that as she was starting to feel a little bit of pleasure, because after all, I was giving her very light, sensual touch, and she started to feel maybe a tad aroused, she heard her mother's voice in her head telling her that she was a slut, right? So a really perfect example of how these early messages really impact our sexuality. And she also told me, and this is again, I know we have a number of people watching from other countries, she also told me how confusing it is, and you can understand this, right? And we all have this, how confusing it is to be told for most of her life, right? Sex is bad, you can only have sex with your husband. And then when you get to the point of actually being engaged, all of a sudden everything shifts on a dime and you're supposed to be incredibly this sexual goddess, which is, impossible because of the shame messages that we received. So that's some information about Sexual Blueprint. I have a wonderful group, some of you are members of, called Talking Love, Sex, and Intimacy with Janae. It's a private group. You have to apply to join, and I approve everybody who applies. And so I'd love for you to join us over there, Talking Love, Sex, and Intimacy with Janae. I'm constantly posting information and new research studies and just, interesting information. And there's some good conversations that are going on. And if you haven't, if you don't know about my book and you haven't purchased it, Living an Orgasmic Life, Heal Yourself and Awaken Your Pleasure, it's a #1 new release on Amazon. Super excited about it. It's really about how to heal your relationship with sex and then how to awaken your pleasure and have a better sex life. It's getting great reviews. I will see you next Friday on Talking Love, Sex, and Intimacy with Janae. Thank you all. Have a great Labor Day weekend.